Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Camille was 67 when they first met. The elderly woman had already thrown a bag of garbage into the iron box when she heard something beeping inside the container. She looked inside and noticed that there was another bag next to hers, exactly the same and slightly moving. That was where the squeak was coming from. Struggling to reach the bag, Camille took it out, put it on the ground, and untied the knot. She couldn't believe her eyes. In the bag lay a skinny red puppy. His fur was sticky, at the edge of his blue eyes were streaming real tears. He looked at the woman hopefully, and at the same time with fright tried to get up on his paws, but could not. Apparently, he was completely powerless. "Who's so nice to you?" whispered Camille. "Come here." She gently took him in her arms and pressed him to her chest. The puppy licked her hand. What a brute. The woman continued to be indignant. They all lost their conscience. The beasts. Camille stood like that for another 5 minutes, trying to think what she was going to do with that poor old thing. She was already getting less and less strength with each year, and now with each month. How long would she last in this world? 5 years at most. And if you shelter a puppy in your house now, then when she's gone, who will the animal be left with? The village where Camille lived has been in decline all her life, as have many like her. Of the old-timers, only 3 remained. She herself is across the street from it. Former teacher Wendy and grandfather Michael, but that one was almost 80. He hadn't recognized almost anyone in a couple of years, just sitting on a bench from morning till night, twisting stinky cigarettes. Most of his acquaintances had gone to heaven year after year or moved to the city to join their children. And the young people who rebuilt their houses as summer homes were different. Many came with their own dogs, loving and purebred. The local abandoned and stray dogs were not liked, and often in the fall they called the stray trapping service, and they were never very ceremonious. So no one knows how the lives of those poor souls they managed to catch and put in a cage ended. Camille and Carrot Top would be gone. They might put him in a cage and take him away to who knows where. She hadn't realized she'd given him a name in the middle of her thoughts. Now, Carrot Top, that's for sure. She was responsible for him. She couldn't wrap him up in a bag and put him back in it, and wishing to take a puppy in their homes is unlikely to find in the village now. The snow was beginning to melt all over the street. It was the end of March. Are the roads washed out? There is almost no one in the area before the start of the vegetable and barbecue season. Well, nothing. Carrot Top summed up her thoughts aloud. "We'll get by somehow. God willing, we'll see what happens." And Camille went home, holding Carrot Top behind the house. She first of all fed the puppy with what she could find. She poured milk, crumbled some bread in it. He wavered and ate with appetite, slowly began to get up on his feet and slightly wagging his tail. On the stove, Camille made more food, heated water, and bathed the puppy, wrapped a thick terry towel, and climbed on the stove with him. Tired from all the worry and all the fuss, she awoke an hour later, and the first thing she saw before her eyes was Carrot Top's smiling face. He looked at her just like a man, sticking out of the towel, muzzle and front paws warmed. Camille smiled back at him. "Come on, we'll find you your new place there, and you'll sleep now." And the woman lit up again. She had even more strength, and her head was clearer. Now there was someone to take care of. There was something to plan for the next few days. It had been 2 years since her evenings had been the same. So it wasn't just the days of the week that Camille got confused. And sometimes she did not immediately remember what month was outside the window. Just 2 years ago, her closest friend, with whom she had been especially close, had died. And then her son and daughter, who now lived in the south by the sea, had given her an ultimatum. Either she would finally move in with them, or they wouldn't promise. Would they be able to visit their mother in the village at least once a year? They have a lot of work. So they said the daughter had her 3rd child. The older 2 have already entered the institute, and the son recently divorced and bogged in litigation, seeking from the young ex-wife's 2nd in a row to leave their child with him. Of course, Camille could not leave the village. Here she was born. Here she spent her starving childhood of the war years. Here, together with her mother, she waited for several years for the return of her father, who was missing at the front. They never waited for him. Her mother, having accepted the fact that her husband would never return, quickly faded away and passed away, leaving the 16-year-old Camille alone. Struggling with the hard post-war life, she had to drop out of school, get a job as a milkmaid at a collective farm, and pull the farm. And she endured. Many of her friends left the village under the guise of going to college, and none of them came back. She too was persuaded to leave with a job, and weavers were needed everywhere. The chairman of the collective farm, though reluctant, let them leave the village. Agitators often came from all over the country. Camille even became friends with one of them. He practically persuaded her to come to his factory in Ivanovo. He promised to help her in everything upon her arrival. But a month after he left, she realized she was pregnant. She wrote letters to the agitator, asking what she should do now. But he never once responded. And on the fragile shoulders of the 18-year-old Camille also fell the burden of caring for her son. With such baggage and such a reputation, it was almost impossible to find a life partner. The girl had already given up hope of finding a full-fledged family. When Ethan, a young agronomist from Tours, showed up in the village, she fell in love with him at first sight. She had never felt such feelings for a man before. Even her fleeting passion for the agitator totally paled before the frenzied onslaught of unspent love that gripped her heart. And strangely enough, Ethan reciprocated. This time it was real, without pretenses, and without betrayal. A year later they married, and soon Betty was born. It seemed that their happiness would never end. Everything was going well in life. Camille even managed to enroll by correspondence with Ethan's patronage, Agricultural Institute, thinking of a future career in the collective farm. Her neighbors also began to treat her with respect, completely forgetting about the past, but it all came to an end, as swiftly as it had begun. Ethan had once died of a heart attack in his sleep. Many times he replayed in his head the twists and turns of his life. Camille couldn't understand where she got her strength from. At that time, she had to start from scratch again. The institute had to be abandoned like she had left school, working a double shift and barely having time to take care of the children at home. She still made it, gave her son and daughter a secondary education, and when they grew up, she sent them one by one to the city to get higher education, so that they could hold on and achieve something that their mother never did. The son was the first to marry. Then the daughter found herself a good husband. Every year for the summer they came to visit. The son fixed the house, which was gradually falling into disrepair, and the daughter and her children loved to walk in the woods, picking berries and mushrooms, and then making jam in the evenings, the aroma of which spread throughout the village. And 2 years ago, they stopped coming, and Camille remained steadfast in her intention to remain in the village for the rest of her days. But after the death of her friend, longing became a permanent guest in her house. Every month she grew heavier, taking the last of her strength. The woman could hardly bring water to flood the bathhouse. It became difficult to get to the store and carry heavy bags of groceries. Even her appetite began to disappear. Just thinking about dragging myself all the way there again. I was so hungry. However, with the appearance of Carrot Top, everything suddenly changed. Not overnight, of course, and not even in 1 week, but gradually. And so began Camille's new life. She was happy, though she did not stop worrying about the dog's fate after she did have to leave. The dog grew up handsome, healthy, with long, shiny in the sun hair, and with the kindest of characters. It even turned out that he was not an easy breed either. So at least claimed the owners of their own dogs, which over the years began to fill the neighborhood. Who had thrown the puppy into the trash 5 years ago was never found out. Yes, the whole 5 years flew by like a day. Neighbors of Grandma Camille blamed, saying, "Well, why did you take on an old head such a burden?" At first, she tried to justify herself, telling how she found Carrot Top at the garbage dump, thinking that her decision would be understandable. Yes, and would have left it there in the dumpster. It was as if her neighbors had rebuked her. That you need more than anyone else on your pension. You can barely live on your own, and this one needs to be fed as well. He's healthy. What a Carrot Top understood everything. Camille knew exactly what he understood. That's why she didn't talk like that in front of him anymore. He wasn't that voracious. It was only the thick fur that made the dog look imposing in size. And when you wash him, you're not such a giant. Thin and fat. And Carrot Top ate rather modestly, although he went for walks often. In autumn, they went together with him on mushrooms, and his eyesight, worn out, could not distinguish Camille mushrooms among variegated fallen leaves. Carrot Top came to the rescue. He sniffed out the good stuff and barked, beckoning his mistress to the next find. Camille loved it. Such hikes. But then one day on one of those walks, she suddenly felt sick. Her heart felt bad, and it had felt bad before, but not as bad as this time. The woman sat down on a stump, grabbed her chest. But she could no longer stand up. She fainted. Carrot Top ran around her for a minute, whining pitifully and licking her pale face with his rough tongue. Then, realizing that the mistress herself would not be able to come to her senses, rushed into the village, attracting all who met him with a loud bark. The first, strange as it may seem, was Grandfather Michael, who still, despite his age, continued to be punctiliously on duty on the bench near his house. He dropped his cigarette, reached his neighbor, and asked him to go after Carrot Top and see if anything had happened to Camille in the woods. He reluctantly, but he agreed and got there in time. He brought Camille into the house, called an ambulance. Fortunately, it had not rained so much in September. The ambulance got safely to the village and took the old woman to the hospital in the nearest town. And for the first time in his 5 years of canine life, Rissik was left alone. The first night, he guarded the house, as a faithful and responsible dog should. And Carrot Top was responsible. Of course, he didn't feel it like any watchdog of the human race. It was more like a state of anxiety. It was as if something was thickening around the house. After all, it wasn't his home after all. And not today or tomorrow threatens to destroy everything here. As luck would have it, the temperature had dropped severely during the night. The stars shone brightly in the sky, and the moon, a huge and unnatural shade that seemed gloomy gray to Carrot Top, floated over the top of the firs, and he felt an unbearable urge to howl. He remembered his lifeless and helpless mistress as she was dragged on a stretcher into the iron box on wheels. The longing went through his heart. He could not help howling long and loud. After a minute, it changed to a song. It was immediately picked up by the other dogs who were still with their owners in the village, and the lights in the windows of the neighboring houses began to light up. A scolding was heard. Carrot Top went silent. No, yelling and complaining won't help. Something else had to be done. Nothing will probably happen to the house anytime soon. The first thing to do is to find the landlady and listen to what she has to say, if she has regained consciousness. Carrot Top went over hundreds of smells in his head, focusing on one of them. It was the smell of that iron box. Particularly unlike anything else, it was the smell of all the cars that drove into the village. And then there was more. And it was also the smell of the little round things that Camille had been drinking water at intervals all day. To this bouquet, something like the smell of Grandpa Michael intervened slightly. When tipsy, he would come out on the bench with nothing. The whole mixture could not be confused. Carrot Top ran out onto the road, and finding the trail from the ambulance, ran low to the ground, muzzling the remaining plume mixed with the scent of asphalt, dirt, and pine tar. It was enough to keep the right direction. The sun had not yet risen above the horizon. As he sat outside the emergency room of the First City Hospital, here all traces were lost. It was necessary to get inside so that the search could continue. Occasionally people would come out of the doors, look at Carrot Top, shake their heads, or smile. Someone even tried to stroke him. It made Carrot Top a little tense. But he let it go. A few seconds were enough for him. As long as the door remained open, he could smell his mistress. She was somewhere out there in the depths of the gloomy gray brick building. The building, of course, was not gray, but dark red, but Carrot Top, like all dogs, did not distinguish red. Near noon, a young girl in a white coat came out of the hospital. She smelled especially strongly of Camille. Carrot Top even stood up, wagging his tail, looking at the stranger questioningly. Doggy muttered, "A long girl. What a beauty. And who are you waiting for? Anyone you know in the room?" The girl leaned over and held out her hand to him. Her hand smelled of medicine and strawberry soap. They had the same at home. Carrot Top licked his warm palm. The little one kept talking to him. "Nurse, I ask in the wards whose dog could be here. Listen, we had a grandmother brought in yesterday." Camille, hearing the painfully familiar name. Carrot Top barked. The girl flinched slightly and jerked her hand away. She barked, and completely different wanted to say, to reassure the stranger. Carrot Top stood up again, wagged his tail, and began to jump with his front paws. The girl smiled again, understanding him correctly this time. "So, Camille," she repeated the name. Carrot Top barked again. "Okay, baby, I got it. When I get back, I'll be sure to ask her. She's come to her senses, so don't worry. But to be honest, your mistress is still very weak. And anyway, let's not guess. God willing." Carrot Top knew few words and did not understand, of course, all the nuances of what he heard. 3 words were familiar to him: Camille, good, and God. But already this was enough for him to conclude that the girl knew his mistress well, that she was now conscious, and that some circumstances did not yet allow him to be sure of anything. In the past, Camille had always talked about God at those moments when she felt uneasy in her soul. The girl walked away. Carrot Top came closer to the door and lay down. He would stay here as long as it took. So he decided. True, he continued to worry about the house too. He had to find a way to settle that as well. He would figure something out. The nurse's name was Evelyn. She had only been working at the hospital for the 2nd month. Very young, fresh out of college. She was a kind, romantic girl. The grayness of hospital life had not yet had time to change her view of her chosen profession. She believed that she would inevitably save people and bring light into the world. She would only gain some experience and enroll in further studies at the Faculty of Medicine. But the first month went somehow sideways. It turned out that the hospital lacked many medicines and that doctors were constantly changing. After working a little and going to commercial clinics, I often had to work overtime. There was a catastrophic shortage of junior and mid-level staff. Many of the nurses often came in drunk, and no one was squeamish about taking money for patients if they themselves offered it. But she will never be like that. That is impossible. The Hippocratic Oath and medical ethics were not an empty word to Evelyn. When she returned from the internal medicine ward to surgery, she went straight to Camille's room. As promised, Carrot Top continued to lie near the entrance. Grandma had lost a lot of weight in 24 hours. Her pale face was riddled with dozens of new wrinkles. Her eyes had become colorless and looked longing and desperate. Camille turned to Evelyn, placing her hand on her arm. "There's a ginger dog at the front door all day." It wasn't by chance that Camille was alarmed. A lively light flashed in her eyes for a second. There was even a slight blush on her cheeks. "Yes, he must be Fluffy, my daughter. Yes, his breed is still such. I forget all this word. That's clever how he found. So his name is Carrot Top. Here's my daughter. I don't know how he'll be without me if God takes me away." "What are you talking about, Camille? We'll fight you again. Everything will be all right. I've already won. I'm a sweetheart." "What is it?" "I have a feeling it won't be long now. You, my daughter, could have brought Carrot Top here at least for a minute. I'd say goodbye to him and give him some instructions. Otherwise, it's not going to be good. If I leave without saying goodbye." Evelyn knew there was no point in arguing now. and her condition was critical. Her heart was barely able to cope. All the tests and results were taken. They said that there was no way she could have an operation. Her weakened body could not withstand it. We could only hope for a miracle. But it's a game of roulette, isn't it? And Evelyn didn't say anything comforting. Animals to the ward. You know, she said, there's no way. Unless it's at night, when the only people on duty are left. I'll take another shift tonight. If Carrot Top will still be at the door, I'll try to bring him in, but no promises. That's as good as it gets. All right, honey. Camille nodded her head. I know what you mean. You could get in trouble for pulling a stunt like that, couldn't you? Maybe. But you should understand me and Carrot Top. Me and him the last 5 years as one. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have lived long ago. He gave me the strength. I'm sorry I can't repay you for your kindness. Come on, Camille. Evelyn interrupted her. What kind of payment? Don't even think about it. You rest now. In an hour, I'll come to give the injections, and then we'll see. Camille said nothing, only closed her eyes and involuntarily rolled down her cheek. A tear she did not even feel. Back in the evening, Evelyn bought dog food at a nearby store and poured water into a small bowl and poured the food on the grass. To the left of the entrance, Carrot Top drank, but would not eat. He wagged his tail as if apologizing to the girl for his lack of appetite and curled up again near the door. Evelyn said something to him from the familiar words and from her intonation. Carrot Top realized that she had kept her promise to him and that he now had a chance to be inside the hospital someday. But when? He didn't know. Thoughts of the house being left unguarded haunted him. But he couldn't go away from the hospital door now, not at all. A bad feeling was beginning to weigh on his heart. At first it looked like the little droplets that came off the icicles in spring. And soon enough, it began to turn into streams. It rattled. My heart was beating more and more frequently. By midnight, a panic had gripped Carrot Top. He got up and began scratching at the door. Fortunately, it opened and Evelyn appeared on the threshold. Are you there, Carrot Top? She said softly. Good boy. Come quickly. Come on in. Carrot Top understood her, cautiously stuck his muzzle in the open door and sniffed. His heart began to beat even harder. Just be careful, please. Almost in a whisper, Evelyn said. Do not bark, quietly follow me. Carrot Top entered and followed the girl, with his tail between his legs and his ears. They climbed the wide stairs with cast iron steps to the second floor. They turned left. By the wall, in the light of a single lamp, sat another girl, also in a white coat. She looked surprised at the couple coming and twirled a finger at her temple, glancing questioningly at Evelyn. She only pressed her index finger to her lips in response. They walked another 10 meters and turned a corner. There, the painfully familiar smell of Camille already drowned out everything else for Carrot Top. He almost barked, but he thought about it in time, because the sign of silence with his finger across his mouth was intended. Now he was even a little foggy. That was the effort the redhead had to make not to deafen the sleeping hospital with his joyful barking. Evelyn opened the ward door and let the dog go forward. That night, Camille was not feeling well at all. She had already begun to periodically fall into oblivion, confusing names and events of her life. Only it seemed to her that the war was still raging around her, and she asked how her father was, whether he had sent her news from the front. Then she spoke to Evelyn, calling her by her daughter's name. Only about Carrot Top woman did not forget, and waited until the nurse was able to bring him to her room. Evelyn had called her son Camille yesterday and told him of his mother's poor condition. He promised to contact the nurse and come on the first train. When Carrot Top came to Camille's bedside and dug his face into her cold hand, she opened her eyes. A smile lit up her face. Carrot Top, she mumbled softly. The boy waited after all. She wanted to stroke the dog's head, but she couldn't do it anymore. See how it turned out. Babe, she went on, sighing heavily with each word. But you and I knew it. We always knew it. So I'm sorry, my friend. Did your mistress last as long as she could? Sorry. The dog stared at Camille, listening to every word she said. She might as well not tell Carrot Top at all now. It was enough that he could hear her heart beating infrequently and with difficulty, the wheezing in her chest, and the slow flow of blood and scent through her veins. Camille's most overriding scent became barely discernible to Carrot Top the way the sun and the stars smelled in the clear night sky. It was the smell of life. If he had known anything about the soul, he would have thought that it was the soul that smelled that way. Only small nuances add to its composition, the peculiarities of a unique personality, and also a kind of kinship code. By the smell you can easily understand who is a daughter or a son, a sister or a brother. Another 10 minutes passed in complete silence. Evelyn stood at the door of the room, crying softly. The cramped space was barely lit by a dim lamp above the entrance. And then there was the street lamp. Its light, entangled in the last leaves of the tall linden trees, cast odd, shifting shadows on the wall. Besides Camille, there were 2 other elderly women in the room, but they were asleep and could not see this strange night scene. Finally, Camille closed her eyes, sighed deeply, and froze. She froze for all eternity. Carrot Top flinched, tucked his nose into her palm. Then he turned and looked at Evelyn, as if looking to her for an answer. But she covered her face with her hands and did not see the dog's questioning gaze. All the scent of the soul finally left Camille's body. Evelyn was afraid that now it would be difficult to get Carrot Top out of the hospital. But when she calmed down a bit and approached him and wanted to say something, he himself rushed to the exit. So she caught up with him only at the door of the emergency room. Evelyn let him out, and he immediately rushed off in the direction of the highway. Carrot Top ran back to his house. Suddenly something told him that that was where he should be now. After all, if the mistress's soul wasn't here, she might have gone back to the house. Where else could she have gone? Of course, the dog couldn't make long logical chains. He thought differently. Ideas and sequences of actions flashed through his head in their entirety at once. If they saw the right shape, then it was possible to follow them without too much doubt. But this last idea turned out to be absorbent cotton. All the time something disturbed its smooth edges, forming a semblance of holes. After running along the highway for a kilometer, did Carrot Top stop? No, that's not where he was going. No Camille in the house. Something is trying to deceive him, to lead him astray. And he believes it. We have to go back. That thought certainly seemed right. Carrot Top turned around and dashed back even faster. He was just in time. The gurney with the body of the dead Camille. It was on its way to the morgue next door. Carrot Top smelled that in a black plastic bag was Camille Gurney, taken away by an orderly, and next to him with papers in his hands walked Evelyn. Seeing Carrot Top, the girl called out to him. He joined the procession. "This is the dog you were talking about?" The orderly asked Evelyn. "Yes, he is. You better try not to chase him if he hangs around the morgue." "Okay." As they rounded the rectangular one-story building, Carrot Top remembered that he had been here once before. Just that year, when he'd taken the bus with a few villagers to pick up the body of a good acquaintance of Camille's. He remembered the smells, too. They were unmistakable. It was from here that people who no longer smelled like their souls were picked up and taken to a cemetery a kilometer away from their village. There they were buried in the ground for some reason. Carrot Top saw all this, and he understood that no one would return from the cemetery. So he had to wait until Camille was put in a wooden box and taken to his last journey. So he decided. For the next 2 days, Evelyn watched Carrot Top from the residence room window. The orderlies and the caretaker did not chase him away. Evelyn brought him something to eat at lunchtime. Only on the second day Carrot Top touched food, but still without much appetite. On the day of the funeral, a bus pulled up to the morgue. 6 people had already crowded in front of the building. Some were talking quietly to each other. Some were smoking in silence, and then looking for a long time for a trash can to throw away their cigarette butts. The Camille kids had arrived 2 days before. Carrot Top had never seen them before. It was Evelyn's day off, and it never occurred to the orderlies to explain to his brother and sister what the red dog had to do with Camille. But they could have guessed it themselves. And for sure they guessed, because they knew about the existence of Carrot Top. But they did not pay attention to him. Carrot Top singled them out especially by their scent, for there was a familiar note about them. But he was not going to impose himself as a buddy. When they brought out an open casket with the body, Carrot Top saw at last his mistress only the front of her face, as his height did not allow him to see more. Camille didn't look like herself at all. The coffin was carried into the bus, and the 4 men began climbing the steps inside as well. Carrot Top walked to the door, hoping to be invited in. "Where did you put that?" "He's got Camille's son on him." "Yes, that's Camille." "The dog," said one of the villagers. "Let him go." But the man didn't say anything back. He swung his hand at Carrot Top and slammed the door in front of him. The bus drove off, and the dog stayed behind, wondering what he was going to do now. That no one wanted Ginger. Now the orderly told him, "Run away now." He waved toward the departing bus. "Maybe you can catch up. There's nothing for you to do here now." And Carrot Top ran away from the place where the village graveyard was. He knew very well. If only he could make it in time. Now, if only he had enough strength. At the cemetery, the dog could hardly stand up from fatigue, but he made it in time. 4 men were lowering a coffin with Camille's body into a hole on ropes. Then the men threw lumps of earth in there and buried the hole. Not many people did. The people dispersed, and Carrot Top was left alone with nobody. For the last few days, he had lost a lot of weight. His hair had changed from white and red to something dirty and brick. Clumped on the sides and on the chest lumps rested a little at a fresh grave. Carrot Top came back to the house at last, cautiously crawled into the hole under the fence. Took a closer look. Even the house seemed to him quite different, as if he had not been here a few days, but at least a year. As if it had shrunk in size, turned gray and soaked, even though it hadn't rained. For almost a week, Carrot Top had been walking around the garden, looking for his own stash, which he liked to hide. Now he had an appetite. He found everything he had managed to hide, drank water from the well bucket, and felt the strength begin to return to him little by little behind the cherry trees in the space between the fence and the blackcurrant bushes. Carrot Top had a sort of secret coven he had built for himself. He liked to hide here during the day. When Camille was resting in the house, he went there to think it over again and look for the right one among the images. When the door over the porch opened and a loud man's voice sounded, "You're here again." The voice was clearly addressed to him. "Get out of here." A large stick flew toward him. Tucked tail, carrot-tailed, rushed back to the hole. Yes, all is now in the house. Is not that a stranger? The house had become a stranger to him. He needed to look for something else, and Carrot Top ran back to the pogast. Where else could he go? The body of his mistress was buried there, even though it was breathless. Maybe that's where his home is now, too. When he reached the cemetery, Carrot Top lay down on the damp, cold ground on top of the grave and curled up in a ball. Pretty soon he was dreaming and dreaming that he and Camille were walking through the autumn forest, as usual, in search of seps and boletus mushrooms. He runs farther and farther into the woods, and the mushrooms are bigger and bigger in size. He is excited. This will be the mistress's delight that Carrot Top finds such giants. He barks, calling for Camille, and is sure that she goes to his barking, while he himself runs farther and farther away. And suddenly he realizes that the mistress is no longer around. He is frightened, rushes back. But the forest seems to be different. Everything around is covered with thorny bushes, and the needles hurt his sides. The hair gets stuck in the branches. Carrot Top is tearing as hard as he can, but the more he tries, the harder it is to escape. Darkness thickens around him. He begins to whimper. Real tears come out of his eyes, and he wakes up. It really is dark. The stars are lit in the sky, and he's still lying on the same damp mound, shivering with cold. He slept for a long time. Carrot Top got up on his paws and shook his body. Lumps of dirt flew in all directions. Now where to lie here? It was as if the events of the dream had crossed the border of reality. And it seemed to Carrot Top that the branches were holding him, and that the thorns kept tearing at him. He had to get out of this darkness. He looked up at the sky and saw that far away in the direction where the hospital was located, fell swiftly downward. A blue star. It made his heart go tickle. A vivid image of an idea flashed in his mind. Yes, he knew where to go. And Carrot Top ran to where he assumed the star had fallen to Earth. City Hospital. The complex consisted of 5 main buildings, a polyclinic surgical department, a therapeutic morgue connected to it by a passage, and a maternity hospital on the other side of the railway line. This was the place where life began, and life ended for those who didn't venture anywhere. Ripped out of the sky, a bright dot pointed Carrot Top toward the maternity hospital. Well, not so much pointing. But for some reason he realized, not really thinking about the reasons for such a decision. The rest of his life was from this moment associated with this place. No one in the yard of the maternity hospital knew Carrot Top. If Evelyn had shown up here, she would have introduced him to all the local staff, including the janitor and the stoker. But he never saw Evelyn again. So the janitor immediately started chasing the dog, waving an intimidating broom. Carrot Top felt that he did this not out of natural anger, but simply out of considerations of his duties. Perhaps he was supposed to keep everything in order on the grounds, including keeping the red-haired dog out. Redhead himself barked at strangers when guarding the house, and not out of spite, but because he felt it was his duty. When the janitor shouted at him, the dog obediently retreated to the far corner of the small park, where there were benches covered with yellow leaves and an old round fountain. Here it was possible to have a drink at the same time. And the weather, it must be said, was beginning to do something incredible. In September, close to noon, the sun was heating up the air to the point where the thermometer read plus 33. That was more than Carrot Top could recall in his short life. In the evenings, when the saving coolness descended on the hot asphalt, the stoker would emerge from his small slanted door. In the warm season, he heated the only boiler that heated the water in the maternity hospital building. It must have been almost impossible to be inside in this heat. The stoker, whom everyone called John, was, unlike the janitor, kind to the redhead. Every day he brought him something to eat, talked about something. He patted him on the head and smoked like Grandpa Michael. He had no teeth in his mouth at all. That's why he couldn't understand a word he said. But listening to John was still a pleasure for him. When he appeared with a cigarette in his hand, the dog would run up to the bench, lie down at the stoker's feet, and look sadly, mingled with incomprehensible hope, at the main entrance of the maternity hospital. It was as if Camille was going to come out of there sooner or later. Of course, he understood that the mistress was buried in a cemetery and could by no means suddenly find herself in that place, from which one did not go to another world, but on the contrary, from another world came to start a new life. But in this case, the image that flashed through the mind of the idea was so undeniable and magnificent that there was no way to question it. Why was it imagined? To Carrot Top he did not know, but hope lurked in his heart. Quite timid at first, but gaining day by day. Irresistible doubts, strength, and the moment that Carrot Top had been waiting for almost a week, had finally arrived. One morning, when the sun had not yet had time to burn the air to the house, a bright green car drove up, out of which a young man in a light suit and with a huge bouquet of flowers waved to someone through the window. He went into the building, and in 20 minutes he came out of there no longer alone, but with a woman in her arms who had a little bundle where you could hear the barely audible squeak of a baby. Carrot Top sniffed the air, and his heart raced. He smelled familiar, painfully familiar, barely audible, but one that seemed to have vanished forever from this world. 9 days ago, Carrot Top wanted with all his might to rush to these strangers. Wagging his tail, and jumping for joy. But he managed to restrain the impulse. He approached slowly and carefully. "A couple with a baby noticed him. Look who's coming to us," said the girl, gently turning the baby to face the dog. "Look, doggy, look how beautiful it is. That's what a dog. Hello, little doggy." The man also smiled, but he still felt some tension. The unfamiliar dog was understandable. "I didn't know what to expect from him." Carrot Tail wagged and stuck his tongue out. The baby couldn't see him with its tiny eyes, unable to focus on anything. But the dog saw him, and now he knew for sure that he had not made a mistake in his expectations. It was this little man that he had been waiting here for so long. Now he must not lose him. Follow him wherever these good people take him. "All right, get in the car," the man told his wife. "Let's go." Before the heat starts, they got into the car, started the engine, and drove away. Carrot Top followed them. These kind people, who suddenly appeared in Carrot Top's life, were named Jenna and James. They had been married for 3 years, having played a modest wedding right after graduating from the Moscow Veterinary Academy. Back in their hometown, they took out a decent bank loan and opened their own clinic. Pretty soon, the loan became the most popular in the whole area, and they managed to pay it off rather quickly. But other problems arose due to the fact that their clinic began to receive clients from competitors. The competitors apparently did not like it, and they did everything they could to make Jenna and James' work more difficult. Once they even tried to set fire to the clinic. Coincidentally, the arsonist was frightened off by police officers returning home at night after being on duty. The situation grew tenser and tenser with each passing month. We had to hire a professional security agency for the clinic. Threatening phone calls began arriving frequently on her cell phone. Nerves were constantly stretched like a string. James and Jenna lived in a private house, which the wife had inherited from her grandmother. They had no pets of their own, as I found out a little later. Carrot Top, they had none, except a flock of pigeons, for which they built a very nice-looking pigeon house on the property. In general, the birth of their daughter was a miracle for them. All the doctors they consulted asserted, as one, that Jenna would never be able to have children. They explained it in medical terms, and the couple realized that, judging by the tests and examinations, this is the way it is. We were already thinking about adopting someone. But still, after weighing all the pros and cons, we decided to wait another 1.5 years. They even went to some witch doctor in a remote village in the hope that maybe at least something would reassure them. Well, the grandmother gave them a very vague and ornate prognosis, saying about a mysterious dog, which will largely depend on whether their dream of a child will come true or not. The first year, they even began to focus on the dogs of their clinic. They paid special attention, grasping at this straw thrown by the healer. But pretty soon, they gave up on that as well. Just when they were about to accept their fate, however, Jenna managed to get pregnant. It came out of the blue. They should have been happy, but suddenly they were scared out of their wits. From that day on, all their energies were focused on not losing the baby. Weekly trips to the doctors, tests, special nutrition. Everything became focused on making sure Jenna had the best possible conditions and complete control. The good thing was that threats from competitors seemed to have stopped. Everyone seemed resigned to the success of the clinic. James even disbanded the guards, leaving only video surveillance and alarms. Ever since Jenna had been admitted to what was considered one of the best maternity hospitals in the area, even though it was not in the regional center, James had not been at ease. Every day he drove to his wife's house, sitting under the windows, wandering in the park while she began to worry about him. His wife didn't ask him to stay home for the past week or to go to the clinic. Otherwise, his sitting under the windows, he would drive her crazy. Though it was hard for the husband to cope, he still complied with Jenna's request. And the birth was successful. A completely healthy girl was born, calm and smiling. The couple decided to name their baby girl only when Jenna came back home from hospital and called her Wendy. What did the light mean that night? A few hours before the birth, Jenna was awake and looking up into the sky. When a star suddenly snapped to the ground, she had time to make a wish. It just happened by itself, without rushing. It was as if the woman was preparing for it on purpose. And as soon as the bright spot, swiftly crossing the horizon, melted away, Jenna went into violent contractions. Had she known that at that same second, a few kilometers away, Carrot Top was looking at the same star, thinking of his dead mistress. If he had understood what it meant to make a wish, he probably would have remembered it that way. Now that moment, that instant wish that flashed in his soul just made him snap out of his seat and rush toward the house with a completely unclear purpose, just as it did now as he ran after the bright green car. He reached Jenna and James's house by noon, tired from running and from the heat. He just collapsed beside the gate in the shade of a small jasmine bush that was nearly leafless. He dozed off for a while and was awakened by the creak of the gate opening. He woke up and jumped to his feet. Lord, he heard James' voice directly in front of him. What are you doing here? Were you following us from the maternity ward? You're a fine dog. Jenna, he shouted toward the house. His wife's head peeked out of the open window. Why are you yelling? James? Well, Wendy, you'll wake her up, she asked, trying to be quiet. Look who's come to visit us, he said, also becoming almost a whisper, and pointed a finger at Carrot Top. Yes, I can't see behind the branches. Who is it? Carrot Top, realizing it was him, ran out from behind the bush to show himself to Jenna. She only covered her face with the palm of her hand in surprise. It's the dog from the maternity ward, she asked. It is, James replied, smiling. What a surprise the woman held out. Look, let her in the wicket and pour some water in a bowl, will you? She must be thirsty. It's such a scorcher. Okay, James agreed. He opened the gate and gestured. He invited Carrot Top into the lot. The dog wagged his tail one more time, looking intently into James's eyes. Then he looked at Jenna. She waved her hand cautiously. He walked behind the wicket and turned around. James continued to stare at him in surprise. What are you afraid of, redhead? Come in with our pigeons. You can meet them later. Just please don't hurt them. The man followed the dog, disappeared for a minute into the house again, and appeared with a large bowl, in which sparkled in the sunlight cold water. Carrot Top greedily gulped down a third of the bowl and didn't bark here. James said with his index finger up, Wendy is our sleeper. Understood. Carrot Top understood that he mustn't make any noise and that he was well received in this house. He mustn't make any mistakes now. Of course, he would do everything, as these kind people say, just to always be near the little creature, which now slept somewhere very near. The heat, meanwhile, mercilessly continued to overtake the city. By noon, the temperature was rising to plus 38. The weather forecasters had long promised a cold snap. But nature offered one surprise after another. The hot autumn turned the city into a desert. At night, the coolness was saving, but the dew was evaporating from the yellowing grass. Within minutes, the streets were deserted. People were anxious to move beyond the lines of the concrete boxes. The sun reflected off the panes of the high-rise buildings, crinkling the plastic parts of the cars. Once they had been parked for half an hour in the wrong place, the emergency services responded. Emergency services couldn't get on the scene in time. James and Jenna had a lot more work to do, too. They took turns driving to the clinic, letting all their assistants go home. Concerned clients with no out-of-town sanctuary streamed into the clinic with their pets, caught off guard by a flare-up of chronic maladies. And in the home pigeon house, it was necessary to make sure that the birds are not overheated in the sun and get plenty of water. Many of them hatched chicks, stubbornly continuing to stay on the eggs. Carrot Top was also suffering from the heat with his hair so thick. It was especially hard on him. It is good that now there is no need to run anywhere. He dared to go away from the house only to the river. It flowed about 50 meters from the village. Everybody in the neighborhood already knew him and considered him to be one of their own. Merry kids, despite the scorching heat, remained the absolute master of the beach. The children danced in the water from morning till night, eagerly accepting the dog in their games. He tried not to be too keen on such fun activities, fearing that something might happen in the house during his absence, 20 minutes on the beach, and then immediately back closer to Wendy and these kind people, who sometimes even started letting him inside the house. James and Jenna had their own separate cars. Jenna had the light green one that her husband drove to pick her up from the hospital, and James had a dark blue one with a roomy interior and a powerful engine. The day that would eventually become the decisive day in the lives of Carrot Top, and Wendy was the hottest of all the previous days. Already in the morning, the dog's heart sensed trouble. As if with the smell of burnt peat bogs in the south, there came a note of impending misfortune. In the morning, after feeding Wendy, as usual, Jenna left for work. Carrot Top didn't go to the beach this time. Something was holding him back, not letting him move, and his premonitions were not deceived. As the sun passed over the zenith, an extremely excited James came out of the house with Wendy in his arms. This had never happened before. Early in the morning or late in the evening, Jenna would leave with the stroller to walk with the little one to the river and back. Carrot Top would invariably walk with her at such times, scanning people in their path for threats. Rarely, of course, did strangers wander into these parts, but he had to keep his eyes open. Red remembered how suddenly Camille had felt sick in the woods and what followed those walks. But at the height of the heat wave, someone would risk taking Wendy out into the sun. That couldn't have happened. Certainly, no one would have put a baby in a car, and the car body smelled as hot as a furnace from 5 yards away. And if James had done such a thing, it meant that something extraordinary had happened. Carrot Top wanted to jump into the car too, but James gestured for him to stop. "Wait here, Red," he said sternly. "Don't worry, it's all right. I'll be right back." But in vain the man tried to reassure the dog. Carrot Top knew by the tone of his voice and by his scent that trouble was near, and that nothing was normal in the whole situation. As soon as the car moved, Carrot Top immediately rushed after it. James drove slowly, carefully, avoiding potholes in the road and making sure not to upset Wendy. He turned on the climate control, but as he pulled onto the highway, it refused to work. Good thing he had time to cool the cabin at least a little. 10 minutes ago, Jenna called him and told him that she had been in an accident right on the loop. She had been hit by a truck in the center square. A truck. The chauffeur collapsed before he could stop. Her car was badly dented. She herself had a badly bruised ankle. The police arrived quickly, but the paperwork and medical examinations were sure to take a long time, and she left the clinic unlocked because she expected to go quickly to get some bandages and hydrogen peroxide, which had suddenly run out. To the nearest drugstore. "Excuse me, please, on the way to the pharmacy," said my spouse on the phone. "Buy 10 kits. The dog needs to be treated, stitched, bandaged." "Where is Wendy going?" asked James, confused. "You put her in the carrier and take her gently to the clinic. I'll take care of things soon and come back with you. We'll take your car back home. Don't worry about me. I'll live." As James drove up to the drugstore, it was getting pretty hot in the cabin. He had to act fast. It took 5 minutes to buy everything he needed, and another 5 to get to the clinic. The city roads were completely empty. In fact, it was surprising that Wendy would have run into anyone. Did James try the climate control again? No, he banged his fist on the dashboard in desperation and got scared himself. "Oh, baby," quietly he said, turning to his daughter. "Sorry, Daddy is a little upset with you." Wendy opened her eyes, but was calm. James parked about 100 yards from the drugstore because it was the only place that had any semblance of shade. He ran out of the car, turned the corner, and was out of sight. He barely had time to catch up with Carrot Top. Carrot Top didn't follow him, but stayed near the car. His eyes were blurring. He barely had enough oxygen to keep himself from falling over. He was terribly thirsty. But despite the fog in his head, the dog felt that Wendy was inside the cabin, and therefore he must stay here and wait for James to return. In the meantime, James had an unforeseen problem. There were two other customers in the drugstore, talking to the disgruntled salesman about something. They looked in such a way that under normal circumstances, James would have gone out and looked for another drugstore. Both of them were so naked and tattooed that the drawings were disconcerting. And also, judging by their demeanor and their not-so-connected speech, they were either drunk or drugged up. Standing behind them, James wanted to wait his turn, but the men continued their conversation without buying anything. Men, James couldn't take it anymore. "Let me buy some bandages real quick. I have a baby in the car, can't leave him for long." One of them slowly turned around, squinted his eyes as if assessing James, and said in a slow, squeaky voice, "Men, the woods are coming down in the rain." He turned away again, not even thinking of giving up his turn. James was outraged. "Could you hurry it up then?" he exclaimed. "You're not the only ones here." "Shut the fuck up," said the other of them, without even turning toward James. "Young man." James turned to the salesman, who also wanted to get rid of these insane visitors, but could not say anything back. "Can I have 10 packs of bandages and 5 vials of peroxide, please, without change? I'm in a hurry." "Are you completely out of line?" The first one turned to him again. "We also have an emergency." "Wait, I told you, and do not move." Apparently, the seller finally chickened out. He took out from under the counter a package of some pills. He put them in front of the boys, sweat rolling down his face. "Go on," he said. "No money. You had a long labor, didn't you?" One of the customers grinned. He raked the package from the counter, turned around, and headed for the exit. The other silently followed him, bumping into James with his shoulder. "Idiots," the salesman whispered when they finally stepped out and wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Bandages for you?" James asked. "And some peroxide," he clarified. The man rummaged through the lower shelves, pulled out what he needed, and placed it in front of James. He put everything in a bag and handed the guy $60. "Keep the change," he added. "Thank you," he added. The clerk didn't answer, but there was a look of gratitude in his eyes. James ran out into the street, but as soon as he reached the corner of the drugstore, the figure of one of the men suddenly appeared in front of him, terrorizing the salesman with a thin blade. More like an awl gleamed in his hand. He stabbed James 3 times in the stomach, and without a word, walked away with his partner. There was a sharp pain. James's eyes went black. He stepped back against the wall, and slowly, trying to press his palm against the bleeding wound, settled down on the hot asphalt. The last thought flashed through his mind, too, was of Wendy. "Left in the car, we need to get her out. From there, we need to call for help." James tried to shout, but it was like the words were stuck in his throat. He couldn't make a sound, and within seconds he was unconscious. In the meantime, Carrot Top, oblivious of his fatigue and thirst, ran around the car with his tail between his legs, unsure of what to do now. Resting his paws on the hot body, he tried to peek into the interior. How was Wendy? At first she was just wiggling her arms, and then, losing her pacifier, she began to squeak softly. What to do? What to do? Carrot Top looked around again, but not a single person on the horizon. He had to run after James and hurry him. How much longer could the little girl hold out? So the dog dashed toward the drugstore, but there he saw an even more terrifying sight. With his back against the wall, James was bleeding. Red licked his face, poked him in the shoulder with his nose, and barked in his ear, but he didn't react at all. Maybe there's someone inside the drugstore. Carrot Top began bouncing in front of the front door, barking loudly and tapping the glass with his front paws. The salesman, thankfully, came out at this noise. He looked at the dog in surprise, then saw James, turned pale, and rushed to the phone to call an ambulance. Thank goodness, half the job was done. Now he had to get the guy's attention to the car somehow. Carrot Top continued barking. The salesman went outside again. He had full bandages in his hands, covering the wounds on his stomach. He pressed the bandages against the absorbent cotton, trying to stop the bleeding. James opened his eyes slightly and looked around incomprehensibly. When he saw Carrot Top, he smiled slightly. Then he realized something, grabbed the fidgeting guy around him by the shoulder, and quietly said his daughter in the car Carrot Top would take him. He pointed a finger in the direction where he parked 15 minutes ago. Here are the keys. Carrot Top calmed down a little. Realizing that James was alive and running away a little to the side, he barked again, as if urging the salesman to follow him. He took the keychain from James's hands and followed the dog. When he reached the car, he looked inside. The baby was no longer moving. The pharmacist opened the door from inside, and the stinking hot air hit him. The guy grabbed the footnote and, with a quick step, headed back to the pharmacy. It wasn't as hot inside. The air conditioner was running slightly, dampening the towels with cold water. The guy began to rub the little girl's face. She moved her arms again and opened her eyes. By this time, an ambulance had arrived, followed by the police. James and Wendy were loaded into the car, and it immediately whisked them away. The police were left to question the salesman, who might well have guessed what had happened. When James went outside, although he did not directly see anything himself, all of this could be seen on the security camera footage, which, fortunately, was working that day. Now Carrot Top could calm down and take his time walking toward the hospital. He knew all too well where they were taking people to pain. A familiar piece of iron he knew, and he wasn't wrong. He met Evelyn at the entrance to the emergency room, next to where he'd spent more than one night. She was delighted to see him. "Carrot Top," she exclaimed. "Why are you here again?" The dog wiggled his body. He was glad to see Evelyn again too, and he lost weight like a baby, stroking the dog's head. The girl went on talking. "You must be thirsty now, I'll take it out. Wait here." 5 minutes later, the nurse came out with a bowl of cold water. Carrot Top drank, and the strength began to come back to him. In the evening, when the heat had died down, a light green car pulled up to the ward and came out. Jenna limped hard on her left leg from the cops and from the salesman she had met at the station. She was already aware of the role that Carrot Top had played in all these events, and Evelyn, who had finished her tour of duty and was leaving the hospital at that moment, told Jenna and the part of the dog's life story that few people knew about. Little Wendy was all right. Jenna was able to take her home the very next day. The girl was perfectly healthy. However, as the doctor said, another 20 minutes in the car, and the worst could have happened. James was discharged a week later. No vital organs were injured. Pretty quickly, they found the junkies who had attacked him. They got the full measure and went to jail for a long time. The pharmacist even overcame his fear and appeared in court as a witness. But then he left town. So just in case, just to be on the safe side. The weather cleared up in a couple of days. A thick pall of clouds covered the sky, and the rains came, tearing the last of the leaves from the trees and carrying them in torrents to the river. The children went to school, and mushrooms sprang up from the ground to make up for lost time. And as for Rizhik, he was now the happiest dog, having found a new home and new kind owners. He grew obscenely fat, got his own personal chair, and complete freedom of action. Nothing was ever done without him, especially things that concerned Wendy himself. He was constantly by her side when she was being fed, when she was being swaddled, when she was being taken out for a walk or to the clinic. He was the only one who knew that this little girl had come into his life for a reason. He remembered clearly that night when a star had fallen from the sky, and the most beautiful image in his life had flashed in his mind. Finalized outside the maternity hospital, life didn't split in two. It began the moment he looked out of the bag and saw Camille's face, and continued by the maternity ward. When James, with Wendy in his arms, appeared before his eyes, his life was won. True, understandable only to him alone. But after all, not everything is for humans to know. Let there be something for the dogs. At least, for those who, like Carrot Top, understand more than is still believed.